Well, hello and welcome to the webinar. This time we're looking at sharing statements between learning record stores, or LRSs, and in particular we're looking at a collaborative project that we conducted between Watershed LRS, Learning Locker, and Wax LRS. So today we're going to be looking at different topics. Ali from Saltbox is going to be talking to us about the benefits of sharing statements. That's benefits both to the learning development department and also to the business as a whole. I'm going to be talking about the actual collaborative project that we conducted, what we did, what happened, lessons we learned from that, and then I'll be following that up with a technical background to how you can share statements between learning record stores. We'll finish that off with a time for questions at the end, but if you do have questions at any point during the webinar, just pop those in the questions panel, and we will save those up and answer them all at the end, or as many as we can at the end. And then we'll follow the webinar up with a blog answering all the questions, whether or not we've got time to get around to them in the webinar itself. So as I said, do keep asking questions throughout the webinar. So I'm going to hand over to Ali now. Ali is going to talk about the benefits of sharing statements between learning record stores. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everybody for joining. As Andrew mentioned, I'm a co-founder at Saltbox, but I'd love to put everything in context of some of the things work I did in my previous life at T-Mobile in the sales training and operations team, which was a regional role. If I think back to this, retail was an interesting environment. It was constantly changing, highly competitive. There was a very clearly defined sales process that we had for our retail, B2B channel partners, and other retail partners. And we quickly realized that, formal training for us was not enough. Training on the soft skills and providing, channel-specific content was useful and important, but it wasn't enough. So we had, two LMSs that were part of our ecosystem. I'm going to walk through kind of a thought process here, what this ecosystem looked like. One of the things as we constantly were rolling out new products and services to stay competitive, we realized that we were able to partner with our manufacturers and built these custom mobile apps to help people learn about and describe the features and benefits of this huge selection of ever-changing smartphones and tablets and other data devices. And we did a scavenger hunt. We drove them back to real rewards where they could win and earn different products. In addition to that, it was important for us to give tools and resources online to help people conduct role plays, peer-led role plays, and one-page FAQ sheets on products and services so they can access the information they needed at the moment of need on the sales floor or on a call with the customer. We also engaged leadership with the field by providing tools for them to observe specific behaviors and to record that information and provide very detailed, specific feedback on a regular basis. And we captured those on forums, and they engaged each other on a social business community as well online. It was already established. And another important component here was looking at the business outcomes. We're constantly looking at reports on handset and service sales and attachment rates, monthly recurring revenue, and we had business intelligence tools and POS reporting tools that really give us a day-to-day overview of what was happening. So since I've described this ecosystem, what this looks like, we spent a lot of money, we spent a lot of resources to build these tools specific to the needs of the employee learning and development. But one of the hard things to answer for us was, one, how do we make it possible for these applications, these systems, to talk to each other? Okay. Sharing resources and content or results of what people were doing and triggering other activities. This was really hard for us to do. And we couldn't answer questions about employee readiness. We didn't really have a good holistic view of what the field needed for us to better support them and what we could have done better. And at the end of the day, what was the result of all this time and money we spent? What were some of the business outcomes, and how do those relate to each other? So one of the things I did was, and many other people in the field did as well, was we went to the IT teams. We partnered with business analysts. We gave them our cost centers, and they would help us with custom integrations and getting the reporting dashboards we needed, Excel files, and so forth. Well, it was a great solution for us in the interim. I found a lot of pain points that resulted from having such a distributed but unconnected learning ecosystem. The first thing was content snaps didn't exchange information. Again, I couldn't trigger certain applications to do certain things based on behaviors or actions in other applications or in the LMS. You couldn't take results and easily put them in the LMS from the scavenger hunt, for example. And then the reporting we got, sometimes it took us 4 to 6 weeks, and actually I'd probably say many times oftentimes it took us 4 to 6 weeks to get the reporting we needed. By the time we got it, it was almost too late to take any action on those insights. It was very expensive to integrate these applications. It was a manual process, and if we wanted to automate it, we had to bring in a consultant and spend a lot of money on some custom integrations. Again, because these systems didn't have a shared language and a way to share results. And we quickly realized that business analysts don't scale well. They have a number of projects on their plates, and if there was, one need, if I had to change, it took a lot longer for me to have that need fulfilled by our IT partners. And one of the things that kept me up at night was, what if we had a new analyst, or what if we introduced a new LMS or a new learning system into this ecosystem? How would that change the process and what we had already established and what we were doing well? And that was really kind of an unknown for us at the time. And I quickly realized, again, I was not the only one. I was one of 21 regions in the country. And each region was doing things in a similar fashion, but they were siloed. This information was siloed. There were insights that were siloed for the business, and it was hard to get at this information all at once in a consistent manner. So this, again, brings me back to really understand why statement sharing. Why is this important in the context of the Experience API? First of all, for those of you who don't know what a statement is a learning record. It's a bit of information about the experience, using experience, defining the Experience API as a record of someone completing something or doing something, or in the form of an actor, verb, and an object. So this is a few different use cases we're laying out here for you. That kind of, if you think back, I can relate this to my situation, my experience at T-Mobile. The first one, LRS is owned by different stakeholders. Imagine if, in this case, we had one of our retail partner businesses that operated independently. They had their own LRS to do their own analysis and to aggregate that information and the statement data in one place, where T-Mobile, the organization, would have their own LRS, centrally or as part of their LMS as well, owned by different stakeholders. And what if we could share that information very easily between different organizations based on certain rules? Still, a lot of the stuff is still to be figured out, but we're on the right track. The second one was out of or into an LMS. This is today very hard. Data is stored in proprietary formats, and it's migrations and sharing of data between the LMS and other systems is actually really difficult. The third one at the bottom left here was kind of my fear. One of the pain points was, what if we had a new LMS integrated, or what happens to all that data? What happens to all that information that was stored in that one application or system that we had as part of the ecosystem? And statement sharing makes this a lot easier because there's a standard format. That's one in the middle and the bottom here. Pushing data from to another non-LRS system. Imagine if all this intelligence, this data about what people are doing and what they're learning was possible to serve this information and this statement data as an input to other systems, to a performance management system to provide additional evidence for reviews. Maybe it's the LRS can serve the BI tool, give views of the data to BI tools for use and consumption at the organizational level for different stakeholders in the organization. And then the last one at the bottom right here is, what if an organization has multiple LRSs? This is the perfect example of, when I was sharing, each region had their own way of building their own reporting dashboards that took 3, 4, 6 weeks. Imagine if this information was contained in a standard format across multiple regions, and each region may have had their own LRS that fed up to a higher level organizational LRS. This is now all possible with statement sharing. So initially, my first thought is, have we solved all these problems? Is this completely done? No, but we've taken the first steps as to demonstrate what's possible. And to really do that well, I'm going to pass it on to Andrew to share with you how it all worked and what we learned. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the particular project that we did, working together with Watershed LRS, WAX LRS, and Learning Locker LRS to actually have a go at sharing statements between learning record stores. And the reason we set about to do that project, we had 4 main goals that we wanted to achieve. The first goal, we wanted to test the specification, test the Tinkan API, Experience API specification, and make sure it actually works. The whole point of this specification is for learning technologies to be able to communicate with one another. And so we wanted to make sure, well, does it actually work? Can we communicate with one another? We wanted to test our own learning record stores, make sure they could actually work together, make sure we were following the specification correctly. And we also wanted to promote collaboration. So we 3 separate learning record store vendors, essentially competitors in the market, but we wanted to work together because we feel that actually Tinkan Experience API is something that's going to transform learning technology, and by working together, we want to transform our industry and benefit everybody. And finally, we want to promote the concept of sharing statements. So Ali's been talking about the various benefits of sharing statements. I'm going to be talking about how you can do it, and we just want to promote the idea that you can share statements between systems, and that can bring you a lot of benefits. So what do we actually do in our project? Well, the first step was just to do some initial investigation. So I got myself an account on the 3 different LRSs, Learning Locker, Watershed, and WAX. I set up a Moodle LMS on my laptop, and I got an e-learning course, in this case the Golf prototype. And I set up Moodle with a plugin, a Tinkan plugin, to launch the Golf example e-learning course. And then that was configured to send the data into Learning Locker, Learning Record Store. Watershed was then configured to pull that data out of Learning Locker, and then Moodle pulled the data out of Watershed to display that back to the learner. So the statements were essentially going in a bit of a cycle here. They're going from the e-learning course that was launched from the Moodle, into Learning Locker, into Watershed, and then on into Moodle. Next thing I tried was to bring WAX into the mix as well. So all these statements that are going from the e-learning course are going into Learning Locker, into Watershed, and then on into WAX LRS as well. So the statements are going through 3 different LRSs just to test that compatibility. I then tried pushing some statements into WAX and then pulling statements back out into Watershed. So we actually had statements going both ways, from WAX into Watershed and from Watershed into WAX. With Learning Locker, we only looked at the one-way link. Between Watershed and WAX, we looked at a 2-way link, just to kind of illustrate those 2 different ways of sharing statements, the one-way and the 2-way links. And the result was that it sort of worked. So the statements all went where they were supposed to, which in itself I think is really impressive. Do you think this is an integration project between 3 separate learning platforms that have been developed by separate vendors independently, that they work together, and the statements went where they went to go, which is really impressive. If you imagine that projects to integrate LMS systems, often they're very time-consuming, often they're very expensive, and there's a lot of development work involved. This was just configuration, taking these 3 LRSs that hadn't been tested together before, and broadly speaking, it did work. Now, there were some issues, which is, I think, to be expected. The 2-way syncing, for example, where we're sending statements from Watershed into WAX and from WAX back into Watershed, that only actually worked one way at a time. If I tried turning it on both ways, it fell over. Some statements always failed, so there were particular statements being generated by the Golf prototype that were being rejected by one of the learning record stores, and actually that was a problem with the Golf prototype, which we've now fixed, and you'll notice that there's a new Golf prototype been released with a number of improvements, this being one of them. The system has to be reset after each batch of statements, so we could set it up and we could send statements all over the place, but after a period of time we'd have to set it up again in order to send more statements. So it was clear that there was some work to be done. There were some things to improve on. So obviously the next step then was to fix some things. And again, the developers worked really independently on each LRS. You know, we identified what the problems were, and we identified where, you know, perhaps one of the LRSs, or well, in fact all the LRSs in some way, there was some minor thing where perhaps they weren't following the specification exactly. And there were some areas where the specification wasn't quite clear, and so we had to clarify the specification. But each of the LRS developers, they worked independently on these issues. There wasn't that communication that you normally need in an integration project between learning platforms. I also fixed some issues with the Golf prototype that were identified as a result of this project. So we fixed those issues. As I said, the teams worked very much independently. And then we had the final proof of concept. So we set up this system where, again, we had Moodle launching the e-learning course into Learning Locker, into Watershed, and then we had the two-way link actually working both ways at the same time between Watershed and Wax, and statements being queried and statements being pushed. And then we also introduced another activity provider in this case, the bookmarklet. The bookmarklet is a way of learners reporting on web pages that they've visited. They click a little button and it reports that they visited that particular web page. That was sending data into Wax LRS, and those statements were going back into Watershed. So you'll see the statements from the Golf example e-learning course were going through into Watershed and into Moodle and on into Wax, and statements from the bookmarklet were going into Wax, into Watershed, and through into Moodle. So Moodle was displaying all the statements from both things within Moodle to the learner, despite the fact it was pulling data from Watershed, and none of the data was going directly into Watershed. It was all going through either Learning Locker or Wax in this case. So a relatively complex system. And actually it worked. We'd have one iteration where we had to make changes, and that time, plugging it all together, after we'd done that development, it all worked first time, which I think is, again, really impressive. And if you try now, if you get an account on Learning Locker, on Watershed, on Wax, and you try this, you will find that it should work first time, because we've now ironed out the issues from the first time round. So just to give you some, to make this a little bit more visual so you can see what was going on as opposed to my diagrams, we've got Moodle down here in the bottom center, and Moodle was launching the Golf example e-learning course on the left. This is a traditional example of a traditional click next e-learning course. So the learner clicks on the next button, and that statement gets fired off into Learning Locker, top left, and you can just about, if you look closer, you can probably see the statement there. Andrew Downs experienced PAR 58 seconds ago. That statement then gets fed into Watershed, and then from there it goes out into Wax and also gets down displayed in Moodle. And we've actually got a screencast. In fact, these screenshots that you see here aren't from the real prototype. They're from the screencast, and we'll share a link to that screencast near the end of the webinar, but you can see the screenshots there. And the bookmarklet statements, in this case, the learner was on Wikipedia. They click on the send statement button. That sends the statement into Wax, and you can see it at the top there. That then gets pulled into Watershed, and again, that gets displayed in Moodle. And you'll notice that the statement isn't in Learning Locker, and that's because we've configured it not to be sent to Learning Locker, not because of any limitation of any of the LRSs. We just wanted to demonstrate the ability to do two-way sharing and also the ability to do one-way sharing, and I'll be talking about those distinctions in a little bit more detail in a moment. So we learned some lessons from the experience, and I think that the most important lesson we learned was that the specification itself is really quite robust. We did make some clarifications to the specification, but they were fairly minor, and generally speaking, the specification itself really didn't really need many changes. The second one is that interoperability is hard. You know, the free LRSs working on this have been involved in Tin Can Experience API for a while. They're top quality LRSs, but still there were some difficulties connecting those LRSs. And interoperability is a very hard problem, and it is often expensive to connect systems together. The Tinker Experience API specification makes that so much easier, so much cheaper, so much faster, but it is still a difficult problem and does still require some work. Again, as I said, if you imagine integrating different LMS systems together, that would have been a much bigger project than just a little bit of configuration and a tiny bit of development work. Also, sharing statements is not the hard bit. The biggest issues that we had actually were getting the statements into the learning record stores in the first place. Again, not very massive issues, but there were some improvements actually made to the Golf prototype, for example, where it hadn't quite followed the specification exactly. And finally, I think we learned that pushing is better than pulling. So LRSs can either push statements from one LRS to another, or that the receiving LRS can pull the statements. And the advantage of pushing statements is that can happen instantly. The LRS pushing the statement can receive the statement and then can push it straight on. Whereas if you're pulling statements, there's going to necessarily be a little bit of a time delay because the LRS has to query for statements. So pushing statements is better than pulling. So that's an overview of the project that we did. I'm now going to dive into a little bit about how statement sharing can work. And we've illustrated one example of sharing statements, but I'm going to talk a little bit broader now and look at, in fact, 6 different ways of sharing statements. So the first example is what we set up between Learning Locker and WAX. Or, in fact, not quite. This one is pushing statements from one LRS to another. So in this case, Watershed, in our example, Watershed was pushing statements into WAX LRS. Certainly the first time round, it was just that one way. The other way around is where one LRS pulls statements from one LRS to another, and that's the example of where Watershed was pulling statements from Learning Locker. We can also do that 2 ways. So it may be that both LRSs either push statements at each other, or they both pull statements from one another, or potentially you could have one LRS doing both the pushing and the pulling. And in this project, we have Watershed pushing statements to WAX and also pulling statements from WAX. So that's how we configured that. Other approaches, perhaps something like a man-in-the-middle approach, where you have another application that isn't a learning record store, which is essentially shifting statements around from different LRSs, sending the statements wherever they need to go. And then finally, you could actually download statements as a file, perhaps a JSON file, download from one LRS, and then upload it to another LRS. So let's look at those in a bit more detail. Firstly, the one-way sharing. This is where all statements in the first LRS are sent to the second LRS, and they don't go back the other way. So this is particularly useful if you've got a scenario where maybe you've got one central LRS and lots of maybe departmental or regional LRSs feeding into that central learning record store. That central learning record store pulling data or having data pushed from multiple sources. And when we talk about statement sharing, the most common question that I get asked is, where is it in the specification? People look at the Think and Experience API specification and they say, actually, I don't really see statement sharing in there. And the reason for that is that there's not a specific section about sharing statements. There are some requirements I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but there's not a specific section, because actually where you are sharing statements, the LRS that's either pushing the statements or pulling the statements, the LRS that's doing the work, is essentially playing the role of the activity provider. So it's the same as sending a statement to an LRS. Essentially, the LRS pushing statements to another LRS is playing that same role. So that's where that's defined in the specification. Next up, two-way sharing. So this is where all statements from each LRS are shared with one another, whether that's a push or a pull or a push and a pull. And again, that's used for systems that need to be kept in sync. If you've got two LRSs and you need all the data in both the LRSs, this will be the approach to use, the two-way statement sharing. And really, that's just one-way statement sharing, but doing it in both directions. The man-in-the-middle application, sometimes this might be known as statement piping, or maybe a statement sharing tool. This is where you have, as I said, a standalone application specifically for moving statements around. So this application isn't going to store the statements itself. It's just going to be configured to pull statements from one place, send them somewhere else. And I imagine this might be particularly useful if you've got statements going all over the place to lots of different systems. Maybe you want to have one central system that controls the movement of statements between LRS and LRS. There isn't a product today that exists, a man-in-the-middle application or statement piping tool. This is purely theoretical, but it certainly could exist. And actually, I was speaking to Brian Miller at Rustici Software earlier today. He's got some code that's not really ready to share, but that broadly speaking does this role in terms of pulling statements from one learning record store and sending it to another. So you never know, something may come out at some point. Download and upload is the next option, and this is where you actually download a collection of statements as a file and upload them to another LRS. This is useful for one-off batches. So if you're going to be sending statements once every 5 minutes, you don't want to be downloading and uploading a file. But if you're going to be doing it on a kind of one-off basis, if you're perhaps doing backup, or perhaps you're migrating from one system to another, this could actually work quite well. The big advantage here of this approach is that you don't need a direct connection between the LRSs. So potentially, if one LRS is behind a firewall or is offline, maybe you've got a learning record store on a ship in the ocean that doesn't always have an internet connection, and you want to move statements across, maybe the download and upload might be appropriate there, although you've got to get the file somehow off the ship, but sort of possibility. But perhaps backup and migration might be more likely, where you want to back up all your statements as a file, or maybe you want to migrate between systems, and it may be that the system you're migrating to isn't ready when you need to shut the old system down, and you need to store the statements for a period of time. You could just download that file. Obviously, the one-way sharing of statements also would work very well for migration if you don't have that time delay. So how does the spec ensure interoperability? How does this actually work? How do we make sure that LRSs can work together? Well, firstly, the specification has a common data structure. And what I mean by that is that these Tin Can Experience API statements have defined properties. We have an actor, we have a verb, we have an object, we have a result, we have a context. Within the actor, we have the actor's name, and we have an identifier for the actor, and there's certain identifiers that are allowed. So specification goes into a lot of detail about exactly what data we can share and how that data is structured. And even if we're sharing data outside the specification, perhaps in extensions, those extensions, the data is in a specific place. So it ensures that any LRS can understand and receive that data and store it and then pass it on. A common data transfer mechanism. So the data itself is standardized, but also the way the data is sent is done in a common way. So the LRSs know what to expect. They know how they're going to receive that data, and they know how they need to send that data. But also the special rules specifically designed for sharing statements between learning record stores. The specific rules for handling conflicting and duplicate statements. So what I mean by that is if an LRS receives a statement with a particular statement ID, maybe it's already got a copy of that statement or a copy of another statement with an ID. What the LRS will do is it will compare those two statements, and it will work out, is this just the same statement that I'm receiving again? Maybe it's taken a different route to get to me, or is it a completely different statement, but somebody's just somehow using the same statement ID, which obviously they shouldn't be doing. And it will respond appropriately depending on whether it thinks it's the same statement or whether it thinks it's a different statement with a different ID, and it will return an error in that case to the person sending the statement so that they know that they're doing something wrong there. And those rules are what allows the LRS to enables two-way sharing between learning record stores. So because if you imagine you've got two-way sharing between learning record stores, learning record store A sends statement number 1 to learning record store B. And then because you've got two-way statement sharing, it's entirely possible that learning record store B will send that statement back to learning record store A. And if at that point learning record store A panics and says, oh, I don't know how to handle this situation, I've already got this statement in there, the whole thing is going to break down. But because there are specific rules and specific ways of handling the fact that you've already got this statement, actually that works perfectly well. The LRS can say, oh great, I've already got that statement, don't worry about it, and just move on and continue sharing statements. Now, it's not just statements. We've been talking about statements really the whole time today, but actually if we're talking about sharing information between learning record stores, there are other types of data that we do need to consider as well. I'm going to talk about 3 of those. The first one is what's known as canonical activity definitions. And what I mean by canonical activity definition is that activities in Tin Can Experience API have a certain definition, a certain name and description, and other information that's included within a statement. But the LRS might have its own definition of an activity, and it can build up that definition of the activity in a number of ways. One of those ways, for example, is that if you, most authoring tools, most e-learning authoring tools, will generate a content package, and in that package there'll be a file called tincan.xml. And within that file, that defines the definition of the activity, the name and the description. And a lot of authoring tools will also put that information within the statement, but not all of them. So, for example, the current version of Storyline 2 only puts that information in the Tin Can XML file. It doesn't put that information in the statements, which is fine if the LRS has got access to that Tin Can XML file, because it can just look up the Tin Can XML and display the name and description. But if you're then forwarding the statements onto another learning record store that doesn't have access to that XML file, all of a sudden that second learning record store doesn't have that data and doesn't have a name and description for the activity, which makes it hard to display that data to the learner. So the second learning record store really needs to query the first learning record store for that canonical activity description, that data that was contained in the Tin Can XML file, or however that data's got into the learning record store. The next type of data is documents. So, for example, bookmarking data. So if your learning record store 1 is storing bookmarking data about a learner, maybe you want to have access to that bookmarking data in learning record store 2. In that case, you're going to have to either push or pull that data into the second LRS. And then finally, person information, whether that's information about the learner and learner preferences perhaps, or maybe it's information about the different personas of a learner. The fact that Mr. Downs on Twitter is the same as Andrew.Downs at tincanapi.com, that's actually the same learner. The LRS might know about that, but the second LRS might not, unless it fetches that information. And actually, I mentioned earlier that pushing is generally better than pulling, but actually in this case, for all these types of data, particularly the canonical activity definitions and the person information, in these cases it's better if the second LRS does a pull. That's partly to do with how the specification is organized, and that information is much easier to pull than it is to push, but also because the second LRS really will know whether or not it wants that information, and particularly in the case of canonical activity definitions, it will know where it's got gaps that it needs to fill in. So it won't need to get all the information from learning record store 1, it'll only need to get the information where it's got a gap. So it makes sense for the second LRS to be doing the pulling in that scenario. So we're going to have a poll now. It should be coming up on your screen. And whilst we're doing that, we're going to start answering your questions. So I hope you've been asking questions throughout the webinar. If you haven't been asking questions, please ask a question now. Any question you want to ask. If it's a question specifically for me or for Ali, do put that in there. And remember, if you just ask one question per person, that'd be really helpful. So, what are the semantics is the first question. What are the semantics? How were vocabularies agreed and shared? That's an excellent question. So, the question there, I think, is about the content of the data being shared between learning record stores. And actually, the way that learning record stores are set up, that the learning record store doesn't actually really need to understand the content of the data. So the data could be about somebody completing a goal-free learning course. It could be about somebody using the bookmarklet. It could be about a face-to-face course. It could be about any kind of learning experience, but the data is structured in a common way, and so the LRS is able to share that to share that data between the learning record stores. Now, important aspect of that, though, is where you come to view that data, you do need to be able to understand that data. And there's a lot of work going on at the moment to produce what's known as recipes and in communities of practice to talk about specific ways of handling those particular scenarios. And I think when we answer this question on the Q&A, I'll include some links to some resources about recipes that can talk about those. And whatever the type of learning activity you're looking into, there'll either be a recipe in place that you can use, or you can create a recipe. Has anyone else got any other questions? I think we've only actually had one question coming in. So I think that oh, we've got another question. We normally have hundreds of questions, so you need to ask more questions, please. Okay, so any information related to specific progress on adoption work with HealthStream LMS? I appreciate that you've asked the question. I don't know the answer to that one. I'm sure I could go away and do some digging, and we can answer that in the. I don't know if Ali, if you've got any information about HealthStream LMS.
No, I don't.
Okay, no worries. Oh.
We can definitely look into it, though, like you mentioned.
Absolutely. So I've got another question coming. What are the pros and cons of using existing verb and activity libraries versus creating custom libraries? Well, you should always, wherever possible, you should use existing verbs and activity types that have been defined by other people rather than creating your own. That's really important, because not for transferring data between your learning record stores. You'll find that will actually work perfectly. But when you come to view that data, if you've used data in the same format that someone else has used that data, it's much more likely that the reporting tool or whatever other consumer of the data is going to be able to understand that data better, and it's going to be able to do interesting things with that data. What did you do to tweak the golf example so that it can send the LRS data to the right learning record store? Apparently we've got lots of questions now, so this is excellent. So the golf example, the particular tweak, if I recall off the top of my head, was that it was for a particular type of question. The format of, I think, the correct responsive pattern, I think maybe we were missing a semicolon or we were missing some square brackets. It was something really minor with one particular type of question type, and that's what we tweaked. But if you're interested in that, we recently wrote a blog outlining all of the changes that we made to the golf prototype. Just, you know, lots and lots of improvements, not just relating to this project, and we'll put a link to that blog in the Q&A. What do you use as a key for person ID? Sharing SSN is usually not allowed. So I think we're probably talking about for the agent in the statement, the actor of the statement, there are a number of different identifiers that you can use. You can use a person's email address if you want to use that, and in fact that's probably the most commonly used. If you're concerned about security of putting the email address in the statement itself, you can actually encrypt the email address and use the SHA-1 hashed email address instead of the email address, which is still obviously a unique identifier based on the user's email address. You can also use what's known as an OpenID, so some platforms like Twitter use OpenID. To be honest, I'm not aware of anybody using that, but it's an option. And then finally, you can use an account on a system, and this is probably the second most common one that we see. So for example, if it's a learner in an LMS, a learning management system, they've probably got an account on that learning management system, and so you could use their, you know, let's say my login was A Downs, and I was on Moodle. We could use my username on Moodle and the URL of the particular Moodle system, for example. How do the configuration options for pushing and pulling statements vary between the different platforms? That's a good question. I think, yeah, every platform that I've looked at, even so, we're Rustici Software. We've got two different LRSs, and the settings are slightly different between the different platforms. So yeah, there is variety, and I would encourage you to get a trial and have a look at all the different LMSs and have a look at that one for yourself. Obviously, you know, we're collaborating on this project. I don't want to, you know, I'm not going to compare our different platforms too much. We have a Moodle courseware that needs to be viewed offline on an iPad. The lesson progressions need to be tracked. How do we do that? So I'm not sure if you mean like an actual Moodle course as in content within Moodle, or if it's a course launched from Moodle. If it's the Moodle content, I believe that Moodle does have a mobile app, but I'd have to look into that. If generally speaking, we'll forget about Moodle for a moment, but generally speaking, in terms of tracking offline content, you need to have a way of storing data offline. And the Tinker Experience API specification doesn't dictate to you how you store that data. You might store that data using HTML5 data storage. You might store that data as a cookie. But there's all kinds of different ways you could store that data. And basically what you do is you wait until you have a connection, and then you can send that data. And the way that Tinker Experience API essentially enables that offline tracking is that there's two timestamps. There's a time when the Learning Record Store receives the data, and there's a time when the event actually happened. Whereas with things like SCORM, there's only one timestamp when the data is received. And so because there's two timestamps, it means that you can send the data later, and it really doesn't matter. The Tinker is designed to cope with that. How do you get an LMS that isn't using Tinker to work with statements? So the first thing I'd recommend is talk to your LMS vendor and say, why don't you adopt Tinker? And probably the question they will come back to you with is, well, what do you want to do with Tinker? So be prepared for that question. Work out, be aware of what you exactly want the LMS to do with Tinker Experience API. Be ready for that question. But yeah, ask your LMS vendor first. If you get nowhere with your LMS vendor, I would encourage you to go and talk to an LRS vendor. You can certainly talk to us. I'm sure you can talk to Saltbox as well, or all the Learning Locker guys, and ask them if they've got any solutions that may be able to help you. So next question. We're trying to distinctly link a comprehensive competency map to XAPI statements in order to measure learner performance and measure this artifact efficiency. What have you done in this space? Any best practices or lessons learned? I'm going to have to read that question again. So we're trying to distinctly link a comprehensive map to XAPI statements in order a comprehensive competency map in order to measure learner performance and measure the efficiency. So I'm trying to think people that have worked with competencies. Ali, I don't know if you have an answer to this one whilst I'm thinking.
Yeah, I'll it's a pretty big question. I'd love to get a little more detail around how you're defining competency. There's many different perceptions and descriptions of what a competency really is, especially when you think about the Experience API and its ability to gather information and results about real-world performance and activities, not just competencies in the sense of sets of skills that have specific activities that are mostly formal training. And there's, competency is an interesting concept here now. There are a number of capabilities in Watershed and WAX and all the LRSs and LMSs even out there in the market today that have ways to help you organize that information, that Experience API data, and ways that will help you map it very flexibly to the competencies you've already defined in your organization. I'm sorry, I don't know if that's the right answer or not. I would love to get a little more information, more detail about that so we can answer it in a follow-up, Andrew.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think we collect, by the way, who you are and what questions you ask. We may well follow you up and ask for more information around that. The next question is, are there any additional recorded webinars covering the Tinker API for someone who wants to start with the fundamentals of a new API? I love that question. That is a brilliant question. And the answer is absolutely yes. So if you go to tinkerapi.com/webinars, there are a number of webinars. Particularly scroll to the bottom of the page and work your way up. Watch them all in order. You'll find there's a number of webinars to cover the basics and covering lots of examples, and then going into more detailed topics. Again, I don't know, Ali, if there's any other resources you want to mention on that?
Yeah, there's a number of blogs and articles out on the. If you want to really get started, there's a lot of great articles out there on well-known forums and publications. Everything from the e-learning guild to ATD, individual blogs, company blogs. There's white papers that are out there that have start from the very beginning of what is this thing and how does it work. What does it mean to me? Also, a lot of great technical resources that Rustici puts out there on the Tin Can API blog. I mean, it's all over the place. And I would encourage anybody to follow along. Follow the hashtags on Twitter, the XAPI and Tin Can API. It's a great place to get involved in discussions and see what people are sharing and saying as well. So just again, resonate what you said there, Andrew.
Cool. So the next question is, how is adoption of Tinkercad going with content dev houses, e.g. Claro? Also, what are you doing to ensure adoption with the broader community who might be using something like LTI on Coursera? Well, in terms of how is adoption going, I maintain a list of adopters on tinkercadapi.com/adopters, and that list, we're adding at least one adopter to that pretty much every week. Claro as an authoring tool is on there, and I think it's been on there for a while, and lots of, I'm not aware of any authoring tool. Actually, no, maybe I'm aware of a couple of authoring tools that aren't adopting yet, but there's not many, and the number is dwindling. A lot of authoring tools are adopting Tin Can API. What are we doing to ensure adoption with broader community who might be using something like LTI on Coursera? We're doing everything we can to talk to learning sites and anybody who's doing anything in learning technologies to encourage people to adopt Tin Can. In fact, the main part of my job is encouraging people to adopt. So yeah, there's a lot of effort involved in speaking to these organizations, encouraging them to adopt, talking to them about the benefits, and helping them to adopt.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Look, add in there. I think you touched on it briefly, but I think the best way for us to get more vendors out there to adopt the Experience API. When I talk to them, as you have, Andrew, as well, I think what I hear from them a lot is, I need to hear specific needs from customers, my customers, and I want to know why. And I think there's nothing more powerful than all of you reaching out to those tools, those vendors. If you feel it's the right integration, you want to see them take action in a particular direction with the Experience API, please share that with them. I think that's more powerful than anything we could do.
Awesome. Next question. Can you please repeat how you avoid duplicate records when you merge records from two LRSs or more? Yeah, the simple answer to that question is you simply follow the specification, and there are certain rules in the specification that mean where you've got duplicate records, it defines exactly how the learning record store should handle that and the errors that should be returned in different scenarios, and how the learning record store should compare statements. So if your two LRSs are following the specification, that should work. It wouldn't actually be merging the records. It would just be the fact that when one LRS receives a statement that they've already got, when we're matching ID, it's not going to replace that existing statement. Question there, what's the difference between Tin Can and Experience API? There's no difference between Tin Can and Experience API. They're two names for the same thing. It's a long story, which I'm not going to go into now. Next question, are there any informatics best practices to convert JSON statements from Tin Can to a relational database like MySQL? I'm not sure of any publications or best practices, but there are certainly tools that can do that. And again, that's something that I recommend ask your LRS vendor about separately, and see if they've got a solution there that can help you. Do you have any suggestions for ways of making Tin Can data more secure? With authorizations been passed on the URL, it seems that savvy users could possibly hack at least their own data. Yeah, excellent question. So Tin Can or Experience API as a specification, it's possible to implement in a way that is less secure than SCORM, and it's also possible to implement in a way that's more secure than SCORM. And the way of doing it more secure is to do server-side tracking. Now, that's good. If security concern, and you've maybe already solved the problem of making sure you've got the right learner at the computer in the first place, if you've solved that and security is a real concern for you, then you should be doing server-side tracking. And with server-side tracking, you're not going to be passing the credentials in the URL. You'll have that configured on the server side, and there's really, well, I'm not going to say no way, because there may be some way that it could be hacked, but it's really considerably more secure and certainly possible to be really, really secure. Our presentations are SCORMed in Articulate 13. The LMS output is set to TinCan API. Once the students receive the timestamp inbound to their device, are we saying that their progression will be tracked offline, then updated them when they're back online? Thank you so much for your help. You're welcome. So in answer to that question, it may be, I don't actually believe this is the case, but for Articulate, but basically a particular authoring tool would have to specifically implement offline tracking. So just because an authoring tool is outputting to TinCan API, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to support offline tracking. It might do. I don't think that Articulate 13 does that. I guess is that Articulate Presenter maybe. I don't think that tool does offline tracking, but I could be wrong. And again, that's something to ask your authoring tool vendor about. Would they be willing to add that feature in? And there are certainly tools out there that do offline tracking that you'd be able to find. Any more questions? Was that the last question? I know, another question. So we're a performance support platform implementing Experience API in an authoring environment. How do we get listed on your adopters list? Excellent question. Well, just by asking that question, I will send you an email, and I will tell you exactly how you can be listed on the adopter list. You'll have a call with me. You'll demo your product. You'll give me your logo and some other information, and then we'll get you on there. And yeah, if anyone else is interested in being listed on the adopters list, feel free to type that in the question chat now, or to email me afterwards, and I can get you added.
Andrew,
next question. Oh,
Andrew,
yeah.
one more thing on that. I think as we find new, since there's vendors and doctors in the call, I would encourage everybody, if you haven't already, test with all LRSs. There's not much more effort required to do that. I would highly recommend it. So test against Learning Locker, Watershed. I think soon we'll have other LRSs out there like Yet Analytics. I don't know, install an open source on-premise LRS for yourself that's out there available in the market. Wax, all of them, Watershed, Scorn Cloud. Use these because you'll find, and you'll help us in some cases find inconsistencies, but at the same time you're assured that you fully tested your content, your Experience API implementation very, very comprehensively. So I'd be happy to hear from you as well if you want to test your integration.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a really good part. I always recommend. Well, I say free LRSs, but definitely, more than free is going to be even better. But free as a minimum. Mm-hmm. So next question: has XAPI been used with mobile learning apps? Absolutely. So we had the question earlier about previous webinars. One of the previous webinars that we hosted was looking at I think 8 different applications of TinCan Experience API, and a number of those included a mobile application. There's loads of adopters that are using mobile apps. So yes, it has been used and continues to be used. Any good feedback on Adobe Captivate authoring experiences? Adobe Captivate will always have a special place in my heart. It was the first authoring tool I used in getting into e-learning. And yeah, Adobe Captivate do have support for TinCan, and I don't have any specific feedback on the quality of that. But certainly you can track Experience API, TinCan statements from Adobe Captivate, absolutely. And I always, I recommend have a go at these tools for yourself, look at the data that's coming out, and make your own judgment. What impact has mobile learning had on TinCan API adoption? I think it probably has had a positive impact. Certainly, a previous employer, when I was talking to people about TinCan, a lot of the reasons for wanting to do TinCan was actually Articulate Storyline. People wanted to use Articulate Storyline's mobile player, and that only supports Tin Can. So that was a good driver for people wanting to adopt Tin Can. So yeah, I think that certainly has helped, and the ability to track mobile learning is a real great benefit to Tin Can Experience API. Someone's put a link, tincanapi.com/presentations videos. Will that be the website to learn more about the Tin Can API? Is there a website? So tincanapi.com is our website, Rustici Software's website. It's packed full of resources. I'm not aware of any, in terms of the volume of resources, I'm not aware of any website that's got the similar number of resources, and I think that they're very good quality resources. So in my opinion, it's the best website, but there are lots of other websites out there as well with resources. I'd recommend just going to tincanapi.com, not with anything on the slash on the end, and then just exploring from there. But yeah, if you just type into Google Tin Can, type into Google Experience API, you'll find lots and lots of resources as well. So that's all we've got time for now. If your question wasn't answered, it will be answered in the Q&A blog, which will also have the webinar recording, and it will have the slides from the webinar. Well, I don't know if I can share with you. I don't know can you see my screen at the moment? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But we have, yes, you can now. So there's also some links to a white paper on this topic and the screencast that I mentioned earlier. We'll put those links in the blog as well. But if you want to scan the QR codes now, if you're that way inclined, or you can copy the links down and you can get the white paper and the screencast. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for all your questions. We really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch with many of you following the webinar. All the best.
Thank you, everybody.